Howdy, and welcome back to me making yet more Victorian underthings, but out of black instead of white fabric because I cannot stop being both goth and extra. Today isn't the most exciting part of this project that I'm working on for Halloween, but it is nevertheless an important one. If you watched my video on my Victorian modern hybrid corset, you'll know that the top of a corset often creates a line, sort of like a panty line, but a corset shelf, if you will, at the top, which can create an impression on the outer garment. So a corset cover was worn in order to prevent that from happening and smooth out any unsightly lines that might have shown even with a bodice or a blouse, depending on what a lady was wearing of the time was wearing. Like with my black chemise, I didn't get too crazy with patterning out this one. I actually also, again, did not make a mock-up. I just took the facing that I had edited in order to create the chemise yoke and extended it so that I had enough to possibly create a long enough corset cover. It did end up laying a little bit weird, so I ended up with a waist-length corset cover instead of it going a little bit below the waist as they normally would, but it still worked well enough that I'm not gonna fuss about it and try and make a new one. And this is more of that cotton lawn that I was using in my other video. I had something like 5 or 10 yards of it, so I have plenty to spare, so I might as well use it for all my black under things. With the way that I was going to fit this corset, once all of my pieces were cut out, I tentatively pinned and sewed the side seams and permanently sewed the shoulder seams. I knew the straps were going to be where they were for the foreseeable future. There wasn't any way that was gonna change too much because it is an exact match to the chemise. But I wasn't sure if the side seams were gonna stay exactly where they were, so I used a really long stitch length for that, because cotton lawn is a nightmare to unpick. But this turned out to be a mistake because I just ended up doing all of my shaping in other places. Once my side seams and everything were done up, I took it over to my dress form, which had my padded corset so that it would be the correct shape, and my chemise over it so that I knew exactly what it would do, and tried to fit about where a Victorian bodice usually would be. Usually Victorian bodices are drafted with princess seams at the back, and then 2 or 3, possibly 1, depending on the lady, darts at the front. I was thinking I could use this as sort of a pseudo mock-up for my actual bodice, but it didn't work that well, so I can't say that I would particularly recommend this method of drafting. I think I got cocky after my chemise draping went so well, even though I didn't end up liking the chemise. I used chalk to mark all my alterations, and then just kind of folded the whole thing in half in order to transfer them over to the other side so that the sides would be perfectly symmetrical. And don't be surprised on this kind of project if your darts come out kind of like wonky or curved. That's why I'm trimming mine and not just sewing the darts themselves along with having to transfer them. They just sort of end up in a curved dart because that's the shape you're going for. You don't quite get a perfectly triangular dot. Then I pinned and sewed the 2 darts. I ended up with 2, and the princess seams, as well as redoing the side seam sewing because Turns out I left the side seam exactly where it was. It was at this point that I put my corset cover back on my dress form and realized that it was wanting to do odd things, and also I was just gonna have to trim the bottom anyway, so I ended up trimming off a whole lot in order to make the corset cover end exactly at the waist with the appropriate seam allowance. Then it was time for the insertion lace, and I'm using my patented top stitch the lace on, cut the back open, and then just top stitch the seam allowance down whilst it's folded over method that I used in my last video, and the same lace as the last video because I had just a little teensy bit left over. It's not the most exacting method, and it's not the most historically accurate method, and it's not the method that looks the neatest, but it looks reasonably neat, and it's a method that I can stand doing. Felling each of the extra seam allowances down would probably be a more historically accurate and neater way of doing it, but I don't really have the patience for that, and I was kind of on a tight deadline with work happening, so I like it. It's also super easy to do, so put insertion lace like this in all of your clothes. I highly recommend it. I'd put insertion lace in all of my clothes if it didn't mean that I would have to ruin a bunch of clothes. Like most corset covers, this closes with a row of buttons at the center front, and I'm just using a bit of pious tape as the placket for this since the lawn is very unstable, and I happen to have it in my stash and wasn't planning on using it for anything else. And for button placement, I don't remember how many buttons, but I used the very technical method of putting the buttons where I want them in order to decide my button placement and just transferred it over for the buttonholes. It's not the most even, but who's to stop me? And I am physically and mentally incapable of sewing a nice, properly hand-finished buttonhole, so like with most of my projects, I just did it by machine and then ripped open the buttonholes with a seam ripper. This was actually very difficult to get through, which is why you see me struggling so much here. For more stash busting power, I went through and I finished my neckline with bias tape, which was also in my stash. I had just a little bit too much. A little more than the neckline, but not enough to do the armholes or the ends of the arms, but it worked out just fine. So now I no longer have most of that in my stash. I'm sure I'll have a use for just a wee baby bit of double fold bias tape at some point. I also sewed the buttons on by hand at some point during this process, but I don't remember exactly when, and I didn't record it because I ended up doing it while I was doing something else, though I can't remember what now. once that was all secure, I was able to draft and then make up the little tiny baby sleeves that went on the corset cover. This wasn't a feature of all corset covers, just some corset covers. You could get corset covers with or without the little sleeve piece, which I am forgetting what they are called now, but I chose to include them because I want to save my bodice from the sweat marks. And for these, I just used some 2-inch wide pieces of lawn that was finished on one edge with a double rolled, like a narrow hem, because it is how I had originally finished the seams on that lawn, and then the other side is pinked, and so are where the side seams would be for it. It's not the prettiest sleeve or the most flattering sleeve if you don't have a bodice over it, but you're gonna have a bodice over it, so I'm not that concerned. My final step was a drawstring bias tape co-finish. I'd originally thought I would be able to tie that drawstring, but I can't because the button placket gets in the way, and that wasn't me being particularly smart, but I am not fixing it at this point. I think it'll be okay. I just figured it would be nice if the bodice ended up being a little bit too loose in the waist or a little bit too tight. That would give a little bit of flexibility, but it has to be too loose for this to have any functionality, so for now it just exists. And with that, the corset cover was done. It fits perfectly underneath my chemise. Well, not quite perfectly, but well enough under my chemise that I'm not gonna feel weird about having it poking out. And I have something to drape my new bodice atop. And I can move on to things like the hoop skirt and the petticoat, which is going to be my next project, as this will be a very involved project, and take 3 videos. And I'm sorry if this video seems a little bit weird. My neighbors have been really loud the past couple of days, and it's been really difficult to try and get this voiceover filmed. So now it's 9 o'clock the night before I'm due to upload this. So, like this video if you liked this video. Subscribe if you would like to see my big ol' ball gown for my Halloween project. Join my Discord if you want more regular updates. And yeah, leave me a comment below.